In the late 1960s, a teen girl who was home alone noticed what she first thought was a prowler in her backyard.
Yeah, but when she looked closer, it seemed as if the light was playing tricks on her eyes.
Yeah, but after a moment, she could tell that this was no trick of the light. The prowler was transparent.
Welcome to Velarcana. Here, we share mysteries that often defy explanation. I research the cases, and my husband tells the stories.
And this one begins in Southern California. Southern California, it is the place to be. I grew up here, you know. During the day, sunshine, golden sands, and a nice breeze. And the nights? Well, except for maybe just a couple of months in the dead of winter, Southern California nights are just beautiful. They're almost always the perfect temperature, which is probably why people there stay up so late and enjoy the nightlife. Sharon was one of those people who like to stay up late and enjoy the nightlife. Some people call them night owls. Well, she was the youngest of 4 children, and she was still living with her family, but she almost always had some place to be or something to do. But tonight, well, she was home alone. The family was gone, and she had the house all to herself. She lived here in this 3-bedroom home on Fauna Street in Montclair, California, and she had just finished at the stove, turned out the lights, and was getting ready to go from the kitchen into the living room when she thought that she saw some movement in her backyard. She couldn't really tell, though. Back then, California yards were a bit bigger. Here, this is a view of the back of the house, about where she thought she saw that shadow. Of course, this happened at night, and back then, that area of the yard, well, it was pretty dark, and she wasn't anywhere near the window. She was actually still in the kitchen, peering all the way across the living room, and then out through the window, first into the patio, and then into the backyard, which itself ran all the way to the back alley. And the movement that she thought she saw? Well, it was all the way to the back, at the very back fence, right about here. Still, the movement seemed real enough, and gave her goosebumps. So, she kept her eyes trained on that spot and then slowly began to move through the living room to the window. And a moment later, she got right up at the window, and after a minute with no movement, she thought, well, maybe she had been wrong, or maybe it had been an animal and it just scampered off. And just as she was about to turn away and continue her night, she saw it again. At first, it was just a little shadow, but then it got bigger. And after a second, well, she could tell this was no small animal. All of the air went out of the room when she realized that a full-grown person was in her backyard, and whoever it was slowly making his or her way along the fence. Well, Sharon just stood there, unable to move. And remember, this was way before cell phones or 911. Not believing what she was seeing, her mind raced. Could it be a neighbor? Maybe one of her friends trying to play a trick on her? No, this was no neighbor. Her friends wouldn't do this. Well, she watched this shadowy figure make its way all the way along the fence, and then it began to cross the backyard toward the house, toward Sharon. Now, if you're like me, maybe you're thinking right about now, why didn't she just run, right? Go out the front door, figure this thing out later. Well, sometimes in these situations, fear can grip a person so strongly that he or she can't even move. And that's what was happening with Sharon. She was paralyzed with fear. So scared, in fact, that she hadn't even realized that she had dropped her plate until it hit the floor. Well, the sound actually startled her, and she quickly looked down. But almost immediately, of course, she looked back up. And when she did, well, she couldn't believe it. This intruder had somehow already made it halfway across the yard, and now she could see that this was a full-grown man. It was a big man. And she could see something else, too. Something that took her fear from where it was to a whole new level. At first, she wasn't sure, but after a moment, it became unmistakable. She was seeing through this person. In order to really understand exactly what happened that night in Montclair, California, we really need to go all the way back to the early 1920s and halfway across the country. Esther Vanita Knott was born in Oklahoma on April 8, 1923, to Monty and Loda Knott. She spent much of her childhood in a home that wasn't too different from this one, far from the city and without electricity. Her father was rough, and it was a much different time back then, a much harder time. She actually started doing adult chores before she was even 12 years old. It was a hard life. Suffice it to say that her childhood wasn't filled with the happiest of memories. So when he showed up, wow. Around the time that she was 16 years old, she met a boy, soon to be a man, named Samuel Lee. And Samuel, well, he fancied Esther, and he could drive, and he had his own car. Theirs was a romance that you only read about. You know the type. Met on a Monday, became a couple on Tuesday. From the very moment that they met, they knew that they were meant for each other, so they spent every day that they could together. After Esther would finish her chores, she would sneak off and ride in his car. Well, this was something that her father just did not like, so he demanded she stop seeing that boy. But you know how young love can be, right? And this one was powerful. So one day, well, Esther just got into his car, and they never came back. The couple drove all the way across the country and ended up in Southern California, and eventually here in his house on Fauna. And at first, everything was grand. But then the war came, and before long, Sam was drafted, and Esther found herself alone, and now she was far from anyone she knew and in this strange place. And that's when it happened. Changed her life and the future of her family's life forever. She ventured out into the community and she found a Pentecostal church. And although the Pentecostal religion may be a fine religion today, back then it was very different. At least Esther's was. Have you ever heard of those church meetings where they bring those snakes to service? Well, that was the type of Pentecostal church that Esther belonged to, and it was richly steeped in eccentric activities. Not only would they bring snakes to service, well, they'd also speak their prayers in strange, unknown languages. Not even the person praying knew exactly what he or she was saying. They'd have visions where they could actually see the things that the rest of us just can't, and they would have real spiritual wars with the devil. Well, at first, Esther was just a visitor, but she quickly became part of the group, bravely held snakes, began to pray in unknown languages, and was often touched by the powerful hand of God, which caused her to holler, scream, and jump around with intense energy. Esther could feel herself getting closer to God, but she could also feel something else. Esther was simple. She accepted God's word as is, which of course made her dangerous, a powerful threat to the other side. And before long, well, the devil began to attack Esther and her family. Shortly after her husband left for the war, Esther had her first child, and she named him Samuel Jr. Eventually, the war ended, and her husband returned, and she had 3 more children, Carl, Dennis, and Sharon, and she took them to church every time that she went, which was several times a week. And the meetings were all, of course, conducted in the same small building with wooden pews and fierce preaching that was almost always about heaven and hell and the spiritual war between them. Esther often felt the power of God and the evilness of Satan, and before long, so did the older children, Sam the most, followed by Carl and then Dennis. But Sharon, well, not so much. She really didn't feel all of that spiritual energy that was around her. She did, however, hear the stories. They all did. Other members of the church would come and they would testify about how they had had a bad omen, or seen a demon, or sometimes, somehow, even fought the devil himself. Although Sharon really didn't believe the stories, some of them were unnerving. How could they not be, right? I mean, after all, her very soul hung in the balance between an eternity in heaven or an eternity in hell. Scary stuff. Because these stories were so dark and so scary, she actually avoided going to church as often as she could, taking solace in the fact that these were, of course, just stories. They weren't really true. But tonight, she couldn't help but wonder, could she have been wrong about those stories? I mean, what else could this be in her backyard except some type of a demon, right? It was transparent, and as it got closer, it began to look as if it were floating. Well, she didn't bother to bend down and pick up that plate. Instead, she made a mad dash through the living room, down the hall, and then toward the front door. The moment she began to run, she saw out of the corner of her eye that this thing changed direction, and it moved like lightning. By the time that she got to the front door, she could see through the glass. The upper half of the door had a window in it, and on the other side of the door, this thing was already standing on the front porch. And she had run so fast that she hadn't realized this until she had gotten right up to the door. And now she was standing face to face with this transparent man. And you know how when you're standing face to face with someone, how you just can't help but to look up into that person's eyes? Well, that's exactly what she was feeling, this overwhelming urge to look up. And that's exactly what she did. And at the very moment that she made eye contact with him, she knew who this was and why he was there. She recalled later that he had the most piercing, crystal clear, ice blue eyes, the most beautiful blue eyes that she had ever seen. And although the rest of him was transparent, well, his eyes were solid. And at the very moment that she saw those eyes, she felt the depth of his being, and it was utterly empty. It was completely void of anything human. There was absolutely no empathy in this man's eyes at all. But there was a pure hatred, a hatred for the entire human race, and the strongest disdain for her. Well, as she was standing there, petrified, she saw him reach for the doorknob, and she immediately locked it and then ran back down the hall. Right about now, I suspect that you just might be wondering, how is it that I know so many intimate details about this story, like knowing exactly what she was feeling when she peered into this man's eyes? Well, the reason that I know so much about this story is because I'm in it. I didn't want to give anything away in the beginning because I normally don't share these types of stories about my own life. But oh yes, I'm in this one. Although it's been more than 50 years, I can still remember it as if it were yesterday. It was 1974, and we were living in Chino, California. And at this point, I was an only child, as my brother nor my sister had been born yet. So I had my own room. Well, I had went to sleep hours earlier, and I woke up with the strongest urge to pee. But once the sleep cleared from my eyes, well, I didn't dare get out of my bed. No, sir. There was a monster in my living room. Now, I knew this because my father was screaming for God to remove it. My father was Samuel Jr., that's Esther's firstborn. He was mostly praying in that unknown language that I told you about earlier. But every once in a while, he'd throw in something like, God, remove this monster from our house and vanquish this evilness that's before me. Things like that. It was scary. And it wasn't only his voice that I heard either. No, sir. I could hear my stepmother's, Shelley's voice as well. And she wasn't praying. No, she was screaming. And you know those types of screams that are obviously real? The ones where the person is screaming at the very top of his or her lungs? Well, those were the type of screams that she was screaming. And she was mainly saying things like, no, please, not me, and I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, God, please forgive me, save me. To me, it sounded as if she was basically pleading for her very soul. So even though I did have to pee very badly, I didn't move from that bed. I just laid there and listened, and it terrified me. Well, this went on for a bit, but after a while it did begin to die down, and then eventually those prayers and screams stopped altogether. And shortly after that, I jumped up out of bed and I rushed to the bathroom. When I had finished and opened the door, I saw my dad waiting right outside. And I'm not sure how we ended up in the living room, but I do remember my dad setting me down and explaining to me what had just happened. He told me that our family, along with many other families in the world, was involved in a spiritual war, and the screaming and the prayers that I had just heard was because a battle had just taken place in our home. The devil, Satan himself, had come to my house. Well, I didn't find out until many years later the details of that bizarre night. But apparently, my father and Shelley had went to see a movie, And the movie that they saw was The Exorcist. And Shelley was so taken with that movie that when they got back to the house, she expressed a curiosity out loud. She said, "I wonder what the devil looks like." And right then, well, maybe I should back up just a bit to give you a clear picture. My parents have these high-back chairs. They're golden chairs. They were very fond of them. Pretty fancy. Well, they had set them up in the living room in such a fashion so that they faced each other. And when my parents returned from the movie, Shelley sat in one of those chairs. So when she was pondering that question, she was actually sitting directly across from the other, which at the moment was empty. Well, right after she had asked that question, something began to materialize in front of her in that other chair. I remember when I first heard about this part of the story, I remember thinking that it was odd because she said that at first she wasn't afraid at all, and I would be petrified, right? Something materializing in front of me. But she said that as this person appeared, a strange calmness dropped over her like a blanket, covering her entire body. And the more solid that this person became, the more calm she felt, and the more perfect he seemed to look. She said later that he was the perfect human male, and once he fully materialized, for a moment she just pondered his beauty and majesty. But then she looked into his eyes. He had the most piercing, crystal clear, ice blue eyes, and at first they were beautiful, the most beautiful eyes that she had ever looked into. But at the very moment that she saw those eyes, she also felt his soul, or perhaps the lack thereof. There was absolutely no empathy in this being at all, just a methodical hatred for humanity and a pure contempt for her. How terrifying, right? Well, it was right there when she started that screaming. And my dad said that he never saw this otherworldly evil being, but he did see just how terrified my stepmother became. And he didn't stop praying until she calmed down and said that the demon was gone. And it was shortly after that that I got up out of bed and then rushed to the bathroom. Now, at first, these two stories, although similar, seemed to be completely independent of each other, right? And, well, I guess up until that point, they were, and they might have stayed that way. But the devil, I guess, he wasn't finished with our family, at least not just yet. You know, I'm not sure at all as to how many times that it happened because I wasn't there. But for a while at least, after Shelley's encounter, whenever Sharon and Shelley were in the car together, they'd both feel the unholy presence of this soulless person with those crystal clear ice blue eyes sitting in the back seat. Whenever they would look into the back seat, of course, they would find it empty. But, and here's the eerie part, whenever they would look into the rearview mirror into the back seat, they could clearly see, just as real as you or I, this man sitting there, staring back at them with that empty expression on his face. Spooky, isn't it? Well, this lasted for a while, but over time, they would see him less and less until one day he just went away altogether, never came back. You know, I grew up hearing these two stories, and a few others just like them, maybe a bit less intense. And I was there that night, and I did hear those cries and those prayers, and they were real. But personally, I never did see a single demon or an angel or the devil. I can't say that I never felt anything scary or maybe just a bit spiritually evil, because I did. But then again, growing up in that environment, who wouldn't, right? As I was putting this report together and reflecting on the memories, I realized that just about everyone who knew of these stories has already passed away. Many of them were dear loved ones, and I miss them so much. And then I thought about my brother. Now, he's about a decade younger than I am, and he didn't really spend much time with Esther's side of the family. For many of his younger years, he actually lived with his grandparents on his mother's side. But I thought that I would give him a call and see what he remembered about Dad. Hey, Mark, thanks for coming on the show. How are you?
Hey, Damon, thanks for giving me a call. How are you?
I'm good. So, the video that Amy and I are currently working on, as you know, is of one of the old stories that the family used to tell. So, do you have any memories of that old religion that the family was involved in?
Well, absolutely. Growing up, obviously, with dad early on before him and mom got divorced, there was church every Sunday. Of course, we would go to Sunday school. Typically, that was the idea. The Pentecostal church. So there was,
Yeah, that's right. That old Pentecostal religion. It actually started out as grandma's religion, and then, of course, Dad grabbed onto it. So, do you remember anything dark about it?
so I mentioned earlier that we would go to Sunday school most of the time with dad. I said most of the time because there was a couple times dad took me to a Wednesday evening service. And that is when you really saw the traditional kind of thing that you would see in a movie when it talks about the Pentecostal church with people kind of running around and hands to the forehead and people getting saved and everyone talking in tongues and just honestly, it was freaky. I'm not going to lie. Sitting there as a child in a pew in the back of the church, watching these grown people act like animals, just wild. It really shocked me as a kid, for sure.
Dad took me to church a lot, and it seemed like they were always preaching that demons were everywhere, and um, there might even be one right here in the church with us right now. Do you have any memories like that?
Absolutely. I mean, you're right. I remember watching a documentary on not too long ago about this teen mania ministries that was going on in the 90s. It was bright and light, and everyone was filled with joy and wonder and hope. The opposite of every time I went to the church with dad. Oh, God, it was absolutely dark and menacing. And I felt as if there was no salvation. You know what I will tell you? You told me that you heard while you were laying in bed and you heard dad talking in tongues while he was trying to exorcise Satan from the house, that you heard him speaking in tongues and you heard him say, Hamdulillah, right?
Yes,
This
yes,
is very close to that.
yes.
I heard that same exact phrase
I just got chills.
on a Wednesday evening while I went to church with dad. That is no joke.
So, do you ever think then that maybe we got it wrong? Maybe Dad's religion was right, and there really are these demons out there ready to take us to hell at any moment?
You know, at the time, I probably did believe that demons existed in an outer worldly realm and would come to Earth to do evil.
Yeah.
Now that I'm a bit older and watching some of your videos, which thank you very much, by the way, there certainly is a possibility of a multiverse theory, and maybe there's some bleed over in some of these things. And so when people don't understand things, it's magic, of course, and it's religion and it's these things. Maybe good and evil aren't things, things just are. And if we don't like it, we call it evil. And if we do like it, we call it good.
Yeah. Yeah. That was great. Thanks so much, Mark. I probably won't use anything after this. So I love you and thanks a lot.
Oh,
Uh,
of course, that's the part you're not going to use.
no, it's not like that. Okay, fine. I love you very much. And I'll go ahead and put this in the show. Um, Amy and I have discovered over the years, for some reason, when people listen to stories of the unexplained, they really don't like all of that mushy stuff. So I hope you're happy. You probably just caused the failure of my entire show. Thanks a lot, Mark.
Well, I love you too. Thanks for putting me in and giving me the interview. And hopefully I did all right for you, and you can edit it down to something that's entertaining for the folks out there.
Stick around. The DNA is next, and I have one more story to share about seeing the devil in the window at Grandma's house. So in the video, I said that I never saw a demon or I never saw the devil, right? Well, that's not exactly true. When I was 10 years old at Grandma's house in one of the back bedrooms, I remember clear as day looking up and seeing on the window glass a shadow of the devil. They had the horns, had the chin, the whole 9 yards, and it was terrifying, right? And this is after that experience. I heard Shelly screaming. So I went out and I was looking, where's that devil? What's going on? Is there a devil out here? And I found out that there was this bush. It had grown in such a fashion as when the streetlights were on, it would cast a shadow on the window. And it made the horns and it made the chin. And it was terrifying. And especially this happening at Grandma's house at this time of my life.
Mm-hmm.
It was very scary.
Right.
So, of course, I made sure to mangle the bush. And it did not look like that after that. But it was really scary. For those few seconds in Grandma's house, I honestly thought the devil was looking in the window.
Right.
That's the truth.
Wow.
So what do you think then about my family story?
Well, you know that I believe that our consciousness shapes reality. And what was going on at the time, they all truly believed that the devil was an ongoing danger and could appear, and they needed to be ready to fight. I think they truly believe they saw what they saw. And it came from that expectation to see it.
Yeah. So what do you make of the fact that they saw the same thing? They both saw crystal clear, bright blue eyes. They both saw this perfect male figure.
Right.
What's that about?
Oh my gosh. Well, of course, the first thing I thought of was they must have talked about it, maybe, or maybe when they talked about the devil. You know, I'm sure the devil is. I don't know. Even when I start to say that, I'm like, yeah, that doesn't make sense. Who's going to say the devil's gorgeous and has blue eyes?
Yeah.
So I do find that part
Freaks me out.
It's intriguing, right? Why would they both describe the same thing? And then the part that gave me the chills, I think the most, was when they would be in the car, and it's, you know, how terrifying is that? You look in your rearview mirror. I'd lose it. I would just lose it. I'm done. So what about you? What do you think?
You know, this was a tough one. I have a difficult time believing that there's demons out there ready to get me and take me to hell. But at the same time, these stories, people in my family were adamant. I heard Dennis talk about this. I heard Carl talk about this. Grandma talked about this repeatedly. Mm-hmm. Sharon never talked to me about it, but I heard her talking to other people about this story. And I was there that night that my stepmother was screaming at the very top of her lungs. And my dad was, you know, going to town with prayer. Yeah. And it was very real. It was very scary.
Right.
So with this one, I don't know. I'm just going to have to say, because I have a difficult time believing it. But then again, I was there with all the experiences. So I'm just going to say, I don't know.
Okay. Well,
leave it at that.
That's fair. That's fair. This case actually reminded me of the Frenchy Theriot, the Maurice Theriot case. He was this farmer who at one point in his life said, I'd rather work for the devil than work for you. You know, right there, I was like, oh, geez, this won't end well. And it didn't end well.
Kind of reminds me of what Shelly said, right? Shelly's like, I wonder what the devil looks like. Well, how about you don't wonder that one?
At least don't wonder it out loud. Right. Did you really say it out loud? That's exactly the point.
So Maurice Theriot said, I'd rather work for the devil out loud.
Right. He said it out loud. And then he wakes up and his wife wakes up and screams and says, Maurice, what happened to your back? And on his back is like scratched in, the door is open. And I was like, oh my gosh, what door? What's going on? And I don't want to give away what happened in the end. We actually did a report on it. And if you'd like to see it, it's here.